I stayed at the expensive Disney Star Wars hotel. It was the worst trip of my life. I know others have expressed similar sentiments before on here, but I am honestly incredibly bothered by how much I paid for the Star Cruiser versus how low budget the whole operation seemed. The lazy theming and lack of environmental storytelling was one thing. No animatronics, only a few alien characters, only one droid. There were so few places to explore, and the whole hotel honestly felt small. It felt like they built the bare minimum: one common space, one cafeteria, one bar, one small garden, a couple locked rooms, which also mostly had minimal theming, and an overpriced gift shop. The cramped rooms were another thing. It's not immersive to be uncomfortable for 2 days because you slept on a hard bunk. It's not immersive to try to put on elaborate character makeup, something all the hype material encourages, in a tiny bathroom. There is no reason on earth they couldn't have made these rooms even slightly bigger and added the typical second queen bed. Especially since they knew the high room cost means several people will be in the same room. The LARP itself was another problem. The LARP is almost entirely based around an app, which doesn't work well on all phones. I don't know if the app was broken or if I was doing something wrong, but the missions and events I was sent to often seemed random and unearned. The actual actors are great with the guests, but there aren't many of them. I feel like if Disney actually paid for more actors rather than almost entirely relying on this app, this wouldn't be a problem. But the last straw for me was the staff, and what I suspect is going on with them. To be clear, everyone on staff was lovely and clearly trying their best. However, our first day there was a snafu with luggage delivery, and our bags ended up in the wrong room. We asked a young woman at the concierge desk for assistance, and she seemed very stressed and overwhelmed, almost on the verge of tears. We all have bad days, and I know jobs like this aren't easy. I tried to be gentle and comforting during the encounter, and when eventually they did find our bags, I was very grateful. But then, during the rest of my visit, I was looking around at the workers and noting that they all seemed a bit inexperienced and really young, just about college-aged. And so I went online after my trip and did some reading and found a post stating people suspected Disney was mostly using workers from the college program to staff the Star Cruiser. And then I looked a little longer and I found this video, and honestly, that's just absolutely stunning. They've thrown kids who are supposed to be learning about the hospitality industry into one of the most expensive hotel experiences of all time, with guests who are more far demanding than average. Like the entire hotel has to be turned over in a couple hours every 2 days. That is incredibly stressful, atypical, and should not be foisted on people who are just starting in the industry. This is the opening year of an experimental attraction that Disney has hyped up a lot, and they're just putting all of that on the backs of beginners. And they are framing this as a positive thing, but like, come on. They are doing it this way to save money. They are charging so much and giving people so little. Disney has always been pricey, but once ITT was worth it, because they created beautiful experiences. Now they just cut costs and expect people to be satisfied with less. So I finally stayed at the Galactic Star Cruiser. Turns out, going to space isn't as great as we expected. And I'll start off by saying that I did watch some of the blogger videos/reviews. I always take those with a grain of salt because I know that sometimes they're not going to be as truthful because they don't want Disney to fire them. I also understand that Disney will probably have their top staff those days. That being said, we paid real human money to go to this. You might need to be a wrestling fan to understand this reference. Let's begin. Coming off the highway, you take an exit and you're immediately backstage. We pulled into a parking lot, which is basically the back of Batu. We were greeted with 2 shipping containers that said Star Wars Galactic Star Cruiser. https://imgur.com/a/mcmph6a. After waiting in our car to valet and outside in a line at the terminal, it took us over an hour to get into the shuttle to take us to space. They do offer you cold bottles of water while you wait, but if you have kids, I highly recommend you bring snacks. It was finally our turn to go to the shuttle, and the screens on the trip up didn't work, so we never actually blasted off into space. The screens stayed sunny the whole time. At check-in, they told us not to grab our outfits because our bags would be waiting for us when we got in. They weren't. It took about an hour additional for our bags to arrive. We didn't change the terminal because it was pretty hot out that day and our costumes would have been too much to wear in the heat. After lunch, we were having trouble with our datapad comms, and the staff at the front desk were pretty clueless. We waited and waited, and missions never appeared. We finally started asking guests how to get missions, and they explained some things to try. When we finally did get assigned activities that night, it started late, so we arrived to dinner late because we were stuck in an activity. After dinner, there was a special captain's toast in the atrium, and the staff hands out drinks to everyone, except us. We actually had to walk up to someone and ask. Only about 20% of us dressed up, and we got ignored a lot by the staff, which I felt was odd. Even trying to talk to the face characters, they didn't really engage with us except Lieutenant Croy. He was awesome. Day 2, we spent a lot of time on Batu doing our assignments. It was hot, so we went back to the ship around lunchtime. The shadow just seemed to work pretty well. We didn't have to wait very long in line, and the staff that they had there was pretty friendly. Later in the evening, we were assigned more activities, and we went to where we were supposed to be. The person we were supposed to meet never showed up. This left a large group of us wondering what happened. When we went to the customer service desk, they had no clue and said just move on to our next mission. When the next mission started, it was late. They started talking about stuff that we were supposed to hear about in the mission they didn't do, which left a big gap, the storyline. One of the other things I didn't originally mention were on the missions we did. Extra people came in that weren't supposed to be there. Some of the missions they have to check you in by your name. I guess that's how to keep the crowd levels down. But the staff didn't do a good job of that. Because extra people came in and there weren't stations for everyone who were supposed to be there. I went to customer service again and told them how upset and frustrated we were because nothing seemed to work like it was supposed to. They said they were sorry, but there was nothing they could really do. The food was great, but the main reason for us going was to feel like we were in a Star Wars movie, and we didn't feel that way at all. During our stay, there was also no Wi-Fi, which was a problem for some of the other guests. Thankfully, we had no service issues during our stay. And there aren't really many spaces around the ship to wander around in. One thing that was supposed to be really cool, what is the climate simulator and your ability to use the Force there. We went in several times during our trip, and there was no staff in there to make the Force happen. That was a letdown, but I understand I can't let everyone do everything. We also found out after the fact that they were supposed to have PhotoPass photographers set up, but we never ran into any of them. We did pay additionally for the private photo sessions, but we don't have those pictures back just yet. Those are 30-minute sessions and they cost $1.99. We also had problems with other guests. I understand this is not something Disney has control over though. It's just something that definitely took away from the experience. 80% of the people on our cruise were not wearing costumes. I understand that dressing up is not for everyone, and that's okay. I'm just mentioning it because I don't want people to think everyone will always dress up. The experience wasn't immersive for us. We also had a problem at meals because dinner is assigned seating, and the people next to us had a kid with an iPad and no headphones, so we couldn't hear the dinner shows. I have a kid, so I understand bringing the iPad, but for the courtesy of people around you, you should at least bring a pair of headphones so you don't ruin everyone else's time. Based on our experience, I do not think the Star Cruiser is worth the money at this time. I know that it just opened, but I really thought that Disney would have some of these kinks worked out. If things would have worked a little bit better, and on time, I think we would have had a much better experience. I apologize if this is poorly written. Writing is not really my strong suit, but I thought it was important to get people an honest review out there. As I mentioned, I did talk to customer service twice while there, and I also did email Disney to let them know about my issues. Now, if you're on the fence about the Star Cruiser, I really recommend waiting for a year or so that way the staff can be trained better and maybe things will go a little bit smoother. If you have any questions, please ask. People keep asking what I paid. It was $5,396.14 for the two of us, and I also booked the extra photo experience, which was $1.99. TLDR, if you're on the fence about going to the Star Cruiser, I recommend you wait. Give Disney time to train the staff. 5/10 update. Still no response from Disney. I will give it until Thursday before I call back. 7:20 seconds, I was given a $200 gift card for my troubles. I finally went to the Star Cruiser. It was awful. Man, we finished our journey on the 9th and I'm still processing it, but wanted to share the highlights and a couple frustrating things to help future passengers or those contemplating a journey. We're huge Star Wars fans and created our own characters and backstories and spent way too much time creating custom costumes, but enjoyed every minute of it along the way. We consider ourselves fortunate to have gone and wanted to experience this before it changes. No spoilers. We most enjoyed getting to meet and know like-minded Star Wars and Disney fans. We lucked out with our dinner-seating neighbors and met the most intelligent and articulate 8-year-old ever who put our Star Wars knowledge to the test. Those who were in character and those just enjoying it were all amazing. You really get to know who you're traveling with, and the guests were by far the best part of this for us. Quickly followed by the actors. They did a great job. The captain in particular was amazing. Her knowledge of obscure Star Wars ships was truly impressive, as was her ad-libbing and performance. Gaia was a superstar for real. Night 1 dinner was amazing. The absolute worst part of the experience was the Disney Play app, Datapad. My husband is a QA tester who specializes in user interface, and this app drove him insane. The frustration was so intense that by 3:30 on day 1, we had to take a break to reset our expectations and remind ourselves we were there to have fun. It's hard to explain, but there is an immense pressure to do it all. And in the first afternoon, you're exploring the ship and trying to figure out how the game works, and when it's not clear, or the app doesn't do what you think it should, you worry you're missing something. The Datapad training wasn't going to help either because it is kept in context of the story and doesn't go into, or even acknowledge, you're essentially playing a game. I think what they really need for those that want it is an out-of-context overview of the game experience from start to finish. Not one that spoils the journey, but one that teaches you how the gameplay mechanics work related to the app. We were not the only ones struggling with it, and in fact, we were able to help a 14-year-old passenger with what little knowledge we had get over his frustrations as well. We saw many people and families in the same boat. It's one thing to know you can't do it all, but it's another thing when you're there and the meter is running. You forget that. The pressure is real. I think it comes down to the bad interface, the glitchy nature of the app, the lack of clear instruction on how the game actually works, and the pressure to try to do it all. So my advice to anyone who struggles with the game, just relax and enjoy it. You can't possibly do everything. You can't win the game. Relax and go with the flow. The other thing that annoyed me was the inexperienced and underprepared non-actor members of the crew, excluding the food staff and servers. I realized on day 2 they were all college program students and suddenly understood why they couldn't correctly answer simple questions, or why they were giving out incorrect or conflicting information. Example: when heading to Batu, they give you a pin so you can be identified easily. We didn't want to lose our pins, so we asked if they had the buttons or stickers we could use and store our pins. The CM handing out the pins said, "Sure, just ask the passenger services crew on Batu, they can give you a sticker." We got to Batu and the passenger services CM said, "No, we don't have those anymore." There were other examples, and in some cases I felt really bad for CMs who were being berated by irate passengers. In one instance, schedule conflicts, related to the app, prevented an entire family from getting into the lightsaber training. It quickly escalated because the CM hadn't been trained how to handle demanding, and in this case entitled, guests. There is a way to tell someone no without causing them to pull out the "I paid $5,000 and you can't let me in" card. But these CMs just don't have that training or experience. I don't know if this is a recent change or this crew was just new, but the logistics of simply running the experience need white glove service, and this wasn't that. Another silly example, the CM who runs the pod service on departure day clearly memorized his spiel for departing and enjoyed giving that to each group of departing passengers. But when he asked me before boarding, "Did you talk to a crew member?" I replied, "About what?" His response was, "Checking out." This just hit a nerve for some reason with me because we had a letter in our cabin the night before that clearly said, "You do not need to check out." So I replied, "We were told we didn't need to check out." He asked me to wait, walked me over to the desk where they said, "You don't need to check out, but do you need a transfer?" I replied that we were told the valet would call us a taxi for Wilderness Lodge. The reply was, "No, you need to call and reserve one. CM name on the bridge can help you." At which point we went to the bridge. Long story short, the taxi driver, who knew more than the onboard CMs, told us they changed their process that day and were now calling taxis to be dispatched only when requested. Taxis were no longer allowed to queue up nearby. Again, not the level of Disney service I would expect. I know these sound nitpicky, But you don't see college students running the Wilderness Lodge or Animal Kingdom Lodge, both of which we experienced this trip. So why is the staff running Star Cruiser not of the same caliber? We did enjoy ourselves, but would be hard-pressed to do it again unless there was something new to experience. It was a great once-in-a-lifetime experience that I would recommend to anyone who can afford it and likes Star Wars and immersion in unique experiences. Happy to answer any questions, but why MMV? Because it seems they are already changing things, and I imagine when the minivans return full force, the transfer process to other resorts will change again. If you do go, as D309, the droid in your room panel, to tell you a bedtime story. It's epic and in multiple parts, so you can ask for more. She was actually one of the highlights of the trip, right behind the actors. I wanted to take her home to replace Alexa, but sadly I don't think that's possible. Yet. For those of you who stayed at the Star Wars Hotel, what happened? Yeah, I did. It was expensive, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who isn't a staunch Star Wars fan. But if you are one, you'd have a great time. The decor and overall immersion was great. I could definitely tell they spent a lot of time and effort, not just money, into capturing the vibe of a Star Wars ship. The rooms had windows that you could open to peer into space. The bar area really felt like a cantina. The bridge was amazing, etc. Dining was really fun as well. A lot of creativity went into making the food look alien. The storyline was really mid, though, and I kind of gave up on following the itinerary with all the story events. Honestly, I'm glad I got to go on it before it closed, but I also wouldn't have done it again. Having to stay in a building for most of the experience gets old towards the end. Stayed there last year with some family who are also huge Star Wars nerds. The beginning was pretty crazy. They put a lot of effort into the presentation of you being flown up to the ship, then leading to the grand reveal of being inside the ship itself. The rooms were pretty novel, with the windows showing where you were in space, even showing you going through hyperspace, which was timed to certain events that would happen throughout the day. They essentially had a ton of tasks you could perform on the ship to help influence the story, be it helping the Resistance, the First Order, or a bit of both. There were some physical things you could do, of course, like an event in which you and a bunch of other people have to help pilot the ship, working in the engineering room to keep yourself moving, lightsaber training, that sort of thing. Aside from those main scheduled events, however, there really wasn't much to do aside from hopping from terminal to terminal, doing a bunch of mini games from your mobile device. I'll say, the food and entertainment were pretty awesome. They had courses from all sorts of planets from Yavin to Mustafar, and each night they had entertainment from a band allegedly popular throughout the galaxy, of course, interrupted at one point by the First Order. Their onboard cantina was pretty cool as well, with an electronic sabacc table and waitresses you could tell loved their job. But unfortunately, that was pretty much it, aside from a few characters walking around you could interact with. All in all, I'd say it was a fun experience, but not nearly big enough to be worth the price tag. I think they really dug themselves into a hole by having the experience focused on the Resistance era alone, along with not giving adults much to do other than watch their, or someone else's, kids running around interacting with the characters and or hanging out at the cantina. The events you could actually interact with were a bit few and far between, as much of a blast as they were, and a lot of interactions around the ship you could witness were blink and you miss them. For instance, allegedly, Chewbacca infiltrated the ship and got locked up by the First Order. All my family and I saw of him was him escaping from the ship aided by an army of kids. Same thing happened with Rey, but we didn't see her whatsoever. No, I'm working class. Stayed there last year with some family who are also huge Star Wars nerds. The beginning was pretty crazy. They put a lot of effort into the presentation of you being flown up to the ship, then leading to the grand reveal of being inside the ship itself. The rooms were pretty novel, with the windows showing where you were in space, even showing you going through hyperspace, which was timed to certain events that would happen throughout the day. They essentially had a ton of tasks you could perform on the ship to help influence the story, be it helping the Resistance, the First Order, or a bit of both. There were some physical things you could do, of course, like an event in which you and a bunch of other people have to help pilot the ship, working in the engineering room to keep yourself moving, lightsaber training, that sort of thing. Aside from those main scheduled events, however, there really wasn't much to do aside from hopping from terminal to terminal, doing a bunch of mini games from your mobile device. I'll say, the food and entertainment were pretty awesome. They had courses from all sorts of planets from Yavin to Mustafar, And each night, they had entertainment from a band allegedly popular throughout the galaxy, of course interrupted at one point by the First Order. Their onboard cantina was pretty cool as well, with an electronic sabak table and waitresses you could tell loved their job. But unfortunately, that was pretty much it, aside from a few characters walking around you could interact with. All in all, I'd say it was a fun experience, but not nearly big enough to be worth the price tag. I think they really dug themselves into a hole by having the experience focused on the Resistance era alone, along with not giving adults much to do other than watch their, or someone else's, kids running around interacting with the characters and/or hanging out at the cantina. The events you could actually interact with were a bit few and far between, as much of a blast as they were, and a lot of interactions around the ship you could witness were blink and you miss them. For instance, allegedly, Chewbacca infiltrated the ship and got locked up by the First Order. All my family and I saw of him was him escaping from the ship, aided by an army of kids. Same thing happened with Rey, but we didn't see her whatsoever. Employees of Disney, what is the craziest thing you've seen happen in the park? I worked at Club Disney for the brief time it was open. We had codes we used on the radio headsets that were coordinated with character names. For instance, Code Baloo meant there was blood that needed to be cleaned up immediately. One day, I'm taking a stroll around the club to check on things when I spot a small boy about 2 years old taking a massive dump right in the middle of the play area. He sees me, starts to cry, and runs away with no clothing on the lower half of his body. I get on the radio and can't think of what to say, as we hadn't discussed a code for human feces in the play area and naked kid running around. So I just called, "I have a code poo situation in the play area and piglets on the loose." Former WDW cast member. I swear most of my crazy stories come from working there. Things I've seen more than once. Adult drop trouser and take a dump next to a line of people and walk off laughing. A mother climb a tree and swing down in the middle of another family's meet and greet with beast. She didn't want to wait in line. 3 people in wheelchairs in the same tree at another time. I have no idea. A man tried to swim in Cinderella's moat during fireworks. I was guarding the ropes, I tackled him. 5. Snow White being thrown over the shoulder of a drunk man in Epcot in an attempt to carry her away. A Brazilian tour group beat the crap out of Donald Duck. Nights of Joy is hell on earth. The park is open to Christian youth groups and has Christian rock bands perform. During these nights, extra staff is put on and extra security because there is sex and drugs and theft happening around every corner. My managers were preparing us for it. They said if you see a bush rustle, kids are having sex behind it. The bathrooms have to be checked every 5 months, and any ride that goes dark for more than 3 seconds will have randy teenagers whipping their junk out. Those nights, those terrifying nights. When I was a kid at Disneyland, I was in line for the train roller coaster ride. A man on the ride got his head ripped off when the coaster malfunctioned, and he hit his head on a beam. The park employees just said the ride was broken and to come back later. They were escorting away the people who were on the ride with the guy who died. A couple days later, we continued on our vacation to Las Vegas, and our first night there, Siegfried and Roy got attacked by tigers. It was a good vacation. Not a cast member, but I witnessed a cast member do this. I was in line at Disneyland, California with a group of Japanese teenage tourists were ahead of me in line. I speak Japanese, so I could understand that they were making fun of Americans. They were mostly saying things to the effect of, "On TV, they seem so cool, but all of these Americans are so fat and ugly." They were laughing and even occasionally pointing at people. I was just staying quiet, but then one of the cast members, who evidently also spoke Japanese, walked up to them and told them in perfect Japanese, "You guys should really be careful. Most Americans can speak Japanese." They all froze up and looked around at people, many of whom were giving them dirty looks. I nodded at them like I was backing him up, and they were horrified. They all left the line promptly afterward. I finally go to Disney World. It was the worst vacation of my life. Sorry for the negativity, everyone. I just need to vent. We planned this vacation for 2 full years. Had to cancel last year for obvious reasons. Finally made the trip from the West Coast. It has been a nightmare every day. We didn't stay on property. That's a whole other story with bonus domestic violence occurring right outside my hotel window. And because of that, trying to book any individual Lightning Lane fast passes has been almost impossible. For example, yesterday we went to HS, and RTR was completely gone by 9 a.m. when we had our first chance to book. We paid for Genie Plus, and the only pass we could book was for Slinky Dog at 4 p.m. That's it. Over $100 for all 7 of us to get Genie Plus for one fast pass. Today we went to Epcot, and it was awful as well. It was packed everywhere. Lines for any food or beverage were minimum 20 minutes, it seemed like, and the few good rides were over an hour minimum. I felt like I was spending my entire day on the phone trying to get an ill for either Remy's or Frozen. We finally got one for 7 hours later, and it was nearly $1.70. On top of all of that, I can't believe how rude and pushy people are. I don't know if it's the pandemic or what, but man, are people just extra mean. I've seen countless people yelling at cast members, pushing their way, cutting in line, and other awful behavior. Cast members don't seem to care, and I can't blame them. They are being treated terribly, too. We're doing MK tomorrow, and I'm just completely demoralized. For how much we had to save to make this once-in-a-lifetime trip, I am so sad at how difficult and lackluster it has been. The most magical moments have been the drive in each morning seeing the Disney World sign. After that has been downhill. I can honestly see us never coming back here, and that makes me very sad. What's the worst experience you've had at Disney? About 11 years ago, my wife and 2 daughters, aged 9 and 7, were waiting in line for a Little Mermaid attraction in Disney's Hollywood Studios park. First you lined up, then you got into a lobby, and then the doors opened and you went into a theater to watch the show. As we got let into the lobby, one of the workers told me that I had to put my popcorn in a bag. He told me that I could get a bag at the vendor outside the attraction. I left the attraction, which wasn't busy, got a bag, and came back. The worker let me back in, and by this time the doors were open and the people were entering the theater. My wife and daughters were just inside the doors waiting for me. As I approached the doors, a worker started yelling for me to stop. He said I wasn't allowed in as I left the lobby. When I continued, he told the attendants to stop me and close the doors. My daughters, who could hear the man yelling at me, started to call "Daddy, Daddy" just as the doors closed. I was then escorted out of the attraction by this worker who was a manager. I explained the situation and that my daughters would be upset because we hadn't discussed where we would meet. He didn't care. When my wife and daughters came out a half hour later, I learned they had been crying the whole time as they didn't know where I was and thought I was in trouble. I went to the customer service area to complain and they apologized and gave me a free pass for another day. They didn't seem very concerned at the way the manager handled the situation or the fact that my daughters had cried for half an hour. This did not compensate me for what my family had been through. Needless to say, it ruined my whole day. It has been over 11 years since this happened, and I still haven't forgotten this awful experience. I have had bad experiences at WDW, yes. They always include other guests. I've had people walk right into me while I am standing still off to the side of a walkway and drinking, causing me to drop my drink all over myself as they ignore the fact that they just tried to run me down. I had a dude get mad at me because he ran in line in front of my wife, and I literally ran in, shoulder checking my wife and almost bowling her over. I guess she saw anger in my eyes while I was checking on her because when I turned to tell the dude to quit being dumb, she stopped me. 30 minutes later, when the rest of his party couldn't find where he was, I declined saving his spot. "You're what's wrong with the park," is what I was told. The dude who slammed into my wife and ignored the fact that there was a person occupying the space he sprinted through actually wanted me to make sure his party would be in front of our party of 2 when he left. I had another dude leave line to do something. Restroom, I assume, leaving his wife and daughter. When he came back, he vaulted the metal cue bar at Test Track and slammed into me from behind. He hit the back of my knee and basically rode it into the ground. He completely ignored it and just faced away from me like he didn't just hit me with his 6'4" and 250-pound body. Apparently, I was the a-hole for saying, "Really, man? Not even Amy bad?" Guy literally started screaming at me for trying to block him. I've been slapped in the face and poked in the eyes by careless people pointing directions in dense crowds. Maybe 1 out of 5 people acknowledge their actions by making eye contact. Of those, maybe 10% apologize. I've been hit with car doors while parking, had people straight up cut at food places, and had a guest try to take a chair from our table while my wife was using the bathroom and get indignant when I say, "No, that's my wife's chair." Disney is amazing. Some of the people who go to Disney suck. It's the same at Universal, though. It's not even a majority. It's just enough that it can start your day trending negative and be difficult to keep your happiness. My wife helps with that. However, I take a lot of photos at the parks, and I can't tell you how many times I've been setting up a shot, testing settings, and been totally lost in thought. And I look up to see 20 people waiting to walk in front of me, and I have no idea how long I've been wasting their kindness. Those moments where some couple is just waiting, or a family, or even a solo guest, and I don't even notice them. That's extremely embarrassing. And I always awkwardly say, "Oh, no, 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 you don't wait for me. Walk where you're going. I'll wait to get my picture. I'm so sorry." Then, as if the other thousands of people at the park will just know that while I'm perfectly content wasting 30 minutes of my time to get the photo I want, I don't want to waste any of their time. That huge wall of text to say there are jerks at the park, but there are far more good people. Even the jerks are probably just running at a billion miles an hour to make sure their family slash friends slash SO have a good time. Waiting for illuminations with my mom in the wheelchair area. She had broken her hip a little over a month before and refused to be a scooter person. So my dad and I had been pushing her around all day. Two middle-aged influencer parents with a very mentally disabled teenager in a fancy power chair parked next to us. We made small talk for quite a while. They talked about their socials and how it was such a blessing they could bring their son to WDW so often because of their subscribers. Once the braziers lit, they started filming take after take. Their boy started groaning and getting agitated, and they kept shushing him. He got worse when the show started, like more afraid than anything. Eventually, it was too much, and he was basically screaming. They stopped filming and started berating him loud enough for us to hear them telling him to shut the fuck up and hold on, god damn it. The dad threw some headphones on him, and that helped. Then they immediately went back to filming and smiling, using him as a prop. I felt shitty for the rest of the night. I told my dad I was thinking about going on their channel and leaving a comment about it. He was like, "If they're making money like they said, doing anything to take that away will make it worse for him." So then I felt really shitty. I did eventually look up their YouTube. They had like 800 subs. Nothing like they said it was. I should have called them out. Runner-up. My sister pointed out a pregnant lady with a homemade shirt that said, "My prince came," across the belly. Like, WTF is with people? While waiting for the bus at the end of the day, there was a family behind us that had multiple adults and one kid. None of the adults were paying attention, and the kid was going back and forth dragging his tongue on probably a 10 section of the railing. It went on for about 5 minutes until he decided to stop. The parents never noticed. It's been 11 years, I still think about that weekly and gag. We were in line for Midway Mania. Sometime pre-COVID, either late 2019 or early 2020, I want to say. There was a family ahead of us. We're all kind of nosy people watchers, adults with no kids. So we realize after a couple of minutes that something bizarre is happening. Little girl is in absolute hysterics while mom is hunched over her, messing with her hair. Mom and dad are having a snappy, angry, whispered argument. And then we realize mom is picking lice out of this kid's hair in the Midway Mania line to go on a ride with a headrest. So we told a CM, but there was nothing they could do. It was the fast pass, Rip Lane, and we asked for a later return time. But they couldn't do much, just let us hang back and put a bunch of groups ahead of us. When we left the ride, same family was at the exit, still picking bugs out of the kid's hair right in the middle of Disney. Grossest thing ever. No one is allowed to die at Disneyland. Did you ever wonder how that's possible? Working at Disneyland is not all it's cracked up to be. There are things the general public is not privy to, although rumors circulate online about certain practices. One of these rumors is true. Nobody is allowed to die at Disneyland. As part of the Anaheim Fire EMT team, we are on site for more serious events. The park staff, known as cast members, have their own team of trained personnel. They deal with everything from small cuts and scrapes to ride-induced sickness. But every once in a while, somebody needs to take a trip to the hospital. When that happens, 2 of us will prepare an ambulance and a nurse will be called in to assist. We transport the patient to a nearby hospital and treat them on the way there, within the short amount of time we have. Starting an IV in the back of a moving vehicle can get pretty hairy, let me tell you. But I've done it on multiple occasions. Potholes can make things really interesting when you have a needle in someone's arm and you're fishing for a vein. The important thing is to make sure you don't hit an artery or poke yourself with the bloody needle, especially if your patient looks like an IV drug user. I've been assigned to the theme park for the past few months and have come to enjoy working here for the most part until today. I'll tell you why. As I've said before, nobody is allowed to die at Disneyland, and sometimes fate is not kind enough to comply with corporate policies. This morning, I was called in to assist with an accident near the teacup ride. It was still early, and the park was quiet as visitors were just starting to file in. The weather was warm and sunny, a typical Anaheim day. But there was a barrier set up near the entrance to the ride. Several people were being questioned and were complaining loudly about their phones being confiscated. A few were in tears and looked borderline hysterical. These people were being taken behind closed doors by men in suits with Disneyland badges. "It'll be given right back to you. Just a moment," a security guard was saying, and I saw him hit the delete button to get rid of the most recent video on a visitor's cell phone. "Park policy," he said, giving the device back to the woman. "Thanks for your cooperation. Enjoy the rest of your day." She started to protest, looking at the deleted file, but her husband grabbed her arm and pulled her away, casting a nervous look at the barricade. The woman eventually relented, and the two of them walked off. "Right this way," the security guard said, looking at me. He directed me behind the barricade, and I saw a very terrified teenager was doing CPR on a decapitated man. With each thrust, blood spurted out from the place where his head should have been. The sounds being made were disturbing, like a wet dog toy being stepped on over and over again. One of the squeaky ones. "What are you doing? Why?" I tried to get the words out but couldn't. "We need you to take over for the kid. This man needs to be taken to a hospital." I stared at the security guard, dumbstruck. A hospital? This man needed to get to a funeral home for cremation. There would be no open casket for this one. You must be kidding. The security guard grabbed my arm and pushed me over towards the kid. "Take over," he said. "The kid is tired. You need to do your job." Another security guard joined him, and the two of them gave me a stern look, which indicated I'd better not argue with them. I tried to explain to them, unsure how they weren't getting it. I tried to tell them CPR was not going to help a dead man with no head, but it was like talking to a brick wall. And pretty soon they made it clear that if I didn't do what I was asked, I would be the one in need of a hospital visit. As completely insane as it was, I got down on my knees and took over, doing CPR on the headless man. Each time I pushed down on his chest, a fountain of partially coagulated blood shot out from the hole at the top of his neck. "What happened to him?" I asked the kid who I'd taken over for. I recognized him as the one who ran the ride. "I don't know, man," he said, shaking and pale. "I just looked up and the dude's head was flying. Man, I don't even know where the damn thing ended up." I pressed down on his sternum again as hard as I could, repeating the same amount of pressure, the same depth, despite the fact that it was all pointless. 100 compressions per minute, 2 inches deep. Ensuring proper placement of the hands. It was all so ingrained in me that I did it perfectly, despite the fact that this man would never breathe again. Eventually, someone who looked like a manager showed up. He was wearing a sharp-looking suit despite the warm weather and had cold blue eyes with no indication of any compassion. "Hey, these guys wanted me to keep doing CPR, I told him, quickly sensing that he was in charge of this clown show. "Can I stop now? He's obviously dead." The man in the dark suit shook his head. "Keep going. Don't stop." He had a look about him that I didn't like. A cold, angry sort of feeling came off the man, like a dark aura. I decided not to argue with him. "Get Bill from Cryo up here," he told one of the security guards. "Tell him to bring the gurney." The man looked around and then whispered under his breath, "And someone get that damn head down from the tree before some kid sees it." A strange black vehicle with mouse ears on top and an enclosed flatbed parked in front of us, and I was forced inside, then made to continue doing CPR on what was essentially a headless corpse. The man's terrified, gap-mouthed visage stared at me from the other end of the trunk, where one security guard held it on his lap, with his face looking outward. The macabre scene was so surreal and horrifying that I had to keep telling myself I wasn't in a nightmare. This was actually happening. "Why are you making me do this?" I yelled at the man in the suit who sat in the front seat. "He's dead!" The man just ignored me as we pulled into a garage marked authorized personnel only, and the weird hearse vehicle continued traveling deeper and deeper into a dark warehouse-like space. Eventually, after a few more minutes of driving deeper and deeper underground, using a series of ramps like you'd find in a parking garage, we came to another steel sliding door. Reaching up to press a button on the ceiling, the man up front looked back at me and locked eyes with me. Almost there, he said. Just a few more minutes. Then he looked at the security guard and furrowed his brow. Jim, what did I tell you about the heads? The security guard's face went red immediately, and he began to dig through a cabinet next to him. It sounded like a drawer full of ice. Then he dropped the head inside. It landed with a loud chunk sound, as if he'd dropped a six-pack into a cooler on a hot summer day at the lake. He raised his thumb in an affirmative gesture, nodding at the man in the suit. Got it. I was dumbfounded, slowing down my compressions momentarily, and the security guard unclipped the gun from his holster. Don't slow down, he said. Keep it going. I got the implied message, but why did they care so much about perfusing the organs of a dead man with oxygenated blood? There was no head. And without a head, the body would be useless. The brain would be dead from lack of oxygen a while ago. And minus that control center, the meat sack I was pressing on with all of my force was essentially obsolete. It was all pointless. Unless memories came back to me of things I'd heard in the past. Hadn't Walt Disney insisted on being cryogenically frozen? No, that was insane. Those ideas were insane. But then, as if confirming my worst fears, I saw the writing on the next steel sliding door read, Disneyland Cryogenics Research Facility. CRF authorized cast members. Only past this point. The next area consisted of massive tanks filled with swirling blue fluid. I saw people suspended in the liquid, their faces frozen like Han Solo in carbonite, their mouths open in silent screams. It's real. I heard myself whisper silently, then refocused my efforts on CPR. Suddenly, it seemed as if there might be a purpose to all of this after all. We pulled into one final large room. It was filled with equipment that looked decades beyond anything I'd seen before. It reminded me of pictures I'd seen of the Large Hadron Collider. Massive, complex mechanical forms that I could never even begin to understand. Here we are, said the man in the suit, getting out of the front seat. He came around to the back and rolled us out on a gurney with the assistance of a few others. Meanwhile, I just continued doing compressions, too terrified to stop. It's okay, the man said, with a surprisingly gentle tone now. You can take a rest now. Thanks for your hard work. Stunned, I got down from the gurney and felt the numbness and pain in my forearms, shoulders, and wrists. I had a lot of practice doing CPR, but that was exhausting even for me. Feeling like I was in a daze, I looked around at the space I was in, taking in my surroundings. What is this place? I asked. Well, the man said, you're going to need to sign an NDA so we can let you out of here. I guess I can fill you in. I saw the headless man was being brought up onto a platform, and his head was being carried up there as well. Large machinery hung down from the ceiling, reminding me of Frankenstein's lab, right before he brought the monster to life. A man in a white lab coat was fiddling with items on cloth-covered tables and preparing instruments, like a doctor about to do surgery. You might have heard about how the man himself once wanted to be frozen, kept in cryogenics until the future, so that he could be brought back to life again. You've heard that right? Most people have. Sure, I wasn't sure if it was true or not. Well, it is, and he's kept down here in this laboratory. But what most people don't know is that a large portion of the profits this corporation brings in goes towards fulfilling that goal. This equipment down here cost billions of dollars to build and install, and we finally got everything set up, just the way we need it. I wasn't really sure what to say. The man just continued on. The thing is, we don't want to try it out on the boss first. What if it doesn't work out? So we've been experimenting with other, volunteers. That's why we had people frozen down here. That's why nobody is allowed to die at Disneyland. We need to use every available resource we have. Those bodies you saw on the way in here? Those were people who suffered accidents in the park or who snuck in after hours. At least, they're the ones who nobody would notice missing. Like this guy? Exactly like this guy. Do you know he has no family or extended relations? Robert Biggs, here's 34 years old, lives alone, and his only real joy in life is coming to Disneyland. My throat felt tight, my stomach began to drop, and it was like there was a concrete block sitting inside my gut all of a sudden. What are you doing to him? I asked, watching as the man in the lab coat skewered his head atop a shiny, sharp steel rod as if he were a giant piece of barbecue meat. A shish kebab. The wet, squelching sounds of blood and viscera being pushed aside could be heard as he slid it into place. Bob's head wobbled back and forth slightly, and then was still. We're going to help him, the man said. Just like we've been helping so many others who died in this park. Or should I say, almost died in this park. The world was turning dark around the edges as I tried to focus on staying conscious. I'd never felt so terrified and jarred as I did at that moment. I really felt as if I might pass out from the overwhelming nature of everything that was happening. But I shook it off and told myself to snap out of it. Who knew what these people would do to me if my lights went out? I imagined myself waking up as a victim of their twisted experiments. A man with two different sets of arms and a second head, maybe? I shuddered. Right this way, the man in the suit said, leading me towards a small steel table. For the first time when he spoke, I saw something else in his eyes. Something hard and dark, like a second entity living within his gaze. A second pair of eyes looking back at me from inside. Here's the agreement we'll need you to sign, he said, holding out a pen and pointing at a stack of papers 3 inches thick. Take your time and read through it all. You don't want to sign something you don't understand. His voice was amicable enough, but the look of the contract told me otherwise. Not only was it as thick as a book, it was typed in what appeared to be a 4 or maybe 5-point font, single-spaced and written in complex legal eyes. The first sentence was 3 pages long. I looked up at the dead man on the platform and watched in horror as the man in the lab coat attached electrodes to his head and lowered a massive device that looked like a huge laser pointer, directing a beam of energy at his forehead. The dead man began to convulse and shake, his eyes blinking open and closed. His arms started moving up and down, his legs pumping as if he were on a stationary bicycle. Holy shit, I muttered, trying to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding up there so that I could read the first sentence of the NDA again. Or try to. It was a brainbuster. The party heretofore referred to as the viewer will be obligated to, on completion of this contract, and without prior understanding of the event heretofore referred to as the disturbance, will... I got to about the same part as before, then blinked my eyes as the words became fuzzy and I lost my place amidst the jumble of tiny letters. It was utterly unreadable. All set? The man in the suit asked, flipping pages until we were at the back of the stack, at a spot marked signature. My eyes drifted up to the platform again, and I saw the dead man was now actually beginning to sit up. He was looking around the room dully, like someone who has just woken from a long sleep. Impossible, I whispered. It's impossible. With a shaky hand, I signed the contract, my signature barely legible. Perfect! Now I think you've deserved to have the rest of the day off, don't you? To reflect. I nodded my head, giving the man his pen back. Jim, show this man out, and get him a ride home. He shouldn't be driving after all he's been through. He patted my shoulder in a condescending way. You've had such a busy day. Go home and get some sleep. I went with the security guard to a waiting vehicle, and the man in the suit called after me. Don't forget about the NDA. You can't tell anyone about this. I turned around, not saying anything. I realized after I got home that I needed to tell people about this. The NDA be damned, I thought, typing this out to share with all of you. It's too important, I told myself. They're stealing corpses and forcing them into undead servitude. That's some evil shit. That's like end of the world, zombies taking over, apocalypse-level evil shit. The man in the suit suddenly made me think of a necromancer, some evil sorcerer bent on keeping people alive against their will. I was starting to think that he wasn't a man at all, but something else, as I thought back to the thing I had seen hiding in his gaze. Who knows what endless tasks the dead of Disneyland are being forced into by that dark modern-day wizard? Someone has to do something about it. And maybe this is the first step towards stopping him. Edit 1. I got a weird email right after posting this. It was a highlighted portion of my contract. I'm trying to make it out, but it's something about the consequences of breaking the NDA. Something about forfeiture of life and livelihood. I'm starting to get a little worried. Edit 2. Okay, it's only been a couple minutes, but already I'm getting really freaked out. There's somebody outside my window. They've been moaning and groaning, and they're walking around in my garden, scraping their fingernails against the window glass. I've tried calling the cops, but it doesn't go through. It's like somebody messed with my phone and hacked it, so I can't call the emergency numbers. It just goes through to the Disney Plus sales department. Edit 3. Somebody is trying to get in my front door. There's more than one of them. I can hear them trampling through the garden and scratching at the wood. I need to get out of here. I'm going to make a run for it. If you don't hear from me again, stay away from Disneyland. And whatever you do, try not to die if you go there. You might wake up as a soldier in the undead army of Walt Disney. Don't try talking to Disney World mascots at closing time. I've always wondered who was behind the costumes. I was unfortunate enough to find out when I took my son on his first trip to Disney World. Being a single father isn't easy. I work as hard as I can to provide for my child, but I need to make enough free time to be there for him. It's a rough balance that I and many others struggle to maintain. It's so rare that I get a chance to spend the entire day with my boy or that I get a break from the stress. So when an opportunity arises, I try my best to make it a reality. So when my son David happened to come across a contest that boasted the chance to win a family package to Disney World, I set my sights on making it happen. His glee, while he filled in the necessary information, was almost enough to make my heart melt on its own. I wasn't naive. Things like that don't happen to us. After losing her, I learned that you can't count on things to work out for you. After David submitted his form, I started to scour my work schedule for any opening I could take and still be there to provide. Earlier mornings got earlier, and my workload increased tenfold, but it would all be worth it. That's what I thought anyway. The contest ran for a month and a half to give people time to send in their entries, and me time to save up for 2 tickets. I stayed up on a night I had free and printed a mock-up letter stating that David had won the contest. Stuffed it inside a white envelope and placed it ever so gently inside our rusty mailbox. Then all I had to do was wait for him to come home. When I tell you this boy's whole world lit up like the 4th of July when he opened that letter. Man, I hope I never forget his smile. Thought he was going to damn near rip his cheek open grinning that hard. We set a date, one where I could get the 3 days off work I needed. Even though the trip was still a few weeks away, David was all packed and ready to go the night he received the letter. He told me all about how jealous his friends were, never even questioned why the family pack only consisted of 2 tickets. I can't speak for all parents, but Disney World was miserable. It was far too hot, and within a few minutes of walking around in the unrelenting sun, I could feel my sweat clinging to my clothing. David wanted to see every bit of the park that he could. He would run up to every mascot. I could tell he was getting flustered with the ones that couldn't talk back. I could tell it was going to be a problem. I love the boy, but he isn't great at letting things go. I guess most children are like that. The park was so loud. My feet started to hurt as we stood for unreal amounts of time in line for one ride at a time. I wasn't there for me, though. I was there to spend time with David and watch him immerse himself in all his favorite movies. Still, though, despite me trying to explain the mascot's silence, he continued to protest. I would have to walk up and pull him away from the silent animals. One David reached forward and grabbed onto Goofy's hand. The expression on David's face dropped and he walked back to me. His hand felt weird. He said to me, "I looked up at Goofy. I didn't care. They could be as animated as they wanted, but the unmoving face always gave me the creeps, the way they can just stare forever." We didn't engage with many after David got creeped out, and I couldn't really get an explanation out of him. We still had far too many things to see anyways. We couldn't be stopping to talk to each and every make-believe character. David's mood slowly returned as we feasted on a monstrously expensive meal and went on a few more rides. We sat together as the sun had long since passed the horizon and watched the fireworks leap into the air. The brilliant spectacle of colors and booms filled the park, and despite all my complaints, there with my boy, it truly was the happiest place on earth. It would have been picture perfect if it wasn't for all the mascots that stood around us. With every glow of the various colors, their features were outlined, and then they'd fade into the dark. It was eerie, and I was glad David hadn't gotten scared. Once the grand finale sent a seemingly endless stream of fireworks cascading into the sky, filling it with bright, sparkling lights, I noticed the mascots had left. Then the fireworks ceased, and our only lights were the sparse place lamps around the park, and after a bit more time of walking around it, was time for us to leave. David said he needed to use the bathroom, so we started our search, but the crowd was flowing like a river towards the exits. I was bumped on my shoulder and turned to face a man who gave me a quick, apologetic glance. That was all it took for David's hand to slip loose from mine. Looking back, I noticed I was alone. My head frantically swiveled, searching through the crowd. My voice raised above the surrounding chatter as best as it could to call his name. And when I didn't hear a reply, I started pushing against the tide. My exhausted body brushed up against an ocean of others as I tried to find a clearing, hoping the herd would thin out. My breath and my heart started to race in tandem as seconds felt like an eternity. AD. Getting near the back of the pack, I could hear a distant and timid hello swimming under the conversations around me. David, it was David. I looked around like a madman, and once only a few people were surrounding me, I could see under one of the lights was none other than Mickey Mouse. Of course, I thought. Of course, David would want to say goodbye to Mickey if he saw him. With the crowd dissipated, I quickly jogged to the oversized rodent and noticed that David had a small collection of tears under his eyes. I promptly asked him what was wrong, and he said that Mickey won't say goodbye to him. The last thing I wanted was for David's final memory of the park to be a negative one. All he wanted was a goodbye. I stood up straight and looked the mouse in his saucer-sized black pupils, then back at my son who was wiping his cheeks. Slowly, I stepped forward and leaned in towards the mouse's ear and did my best to keep a whisper my son could hear. Hey, I know you're not supposed to. Even if it's the worst impression, please just say goodbye. There was a moment of silence, and when I didn't receive a response, I started to pull away from Mickey. Daddy. David chimed in, and when I turned my head, I noticed that Goofy had closed in on us. Looking back to Mickey, in the dark, when I stared into his pupils, it seemed like the dark they were made of was swirling. I told David that we should just get going, but he said he wanted a goodbye and grabbed Mickey's hand. Mickey grabbed back. And the grip must have been strong as David immediately started to struggle against it and screamed for me. What the hell? I shouted towards the rat. I reached out to grab Mickey's arm, and when my hands made contact, I understood David's previous statement. Weird was the only word I could come up with, too. Whatever was under the costume was much skinnier than a person should be. The mass I grabbed onto felt like it was constantly shifting around under my hands. I wanted to leave the park, but I also wanted to give my son fond memories of it. I didn't want things to get physical. I turned to look at David, but instead of being able to focus on calming him down, I noticed Goofy was walking closer to us. The illumination above us cast completely on the front of Goofy, and the costume's fabric was writhing. Like hundreds of fingers were under the costume, all pressing on the inside of it. That was enough. I'd just buy the kids some damn ice cream on the way home. Let go, or I'm going to hit you, I warned. I was tired, but the thing under my hands didn't feel like it had any muscle to speak of. Yet it continued its dead gaze into my eyes. David's cries echoing in my head, I reeled back and threw a punch towards the cartoon's head. I thought it had come completely off, but it was just hanging off its shoulder, held together by a thin black string. A string that was moving around to pull the head back into place. Mickey's grip loosened, and David was able to wriggle free, but me, I could feel two light brown arms wrapping around me. Run to the exit, David, I exclaimed as I wrestled against the dog trying to hold me in place. That's enough. A sweet voice commanded, and in response, Goofy pulled away from me. I adjusted my gaze to the female voice that saved me. Sorry, nighttime is feeding time. She spoke. I was beside myself as I looked into the face of Sleeping Beauty. The actor stood under the lamp across the path, with her hands clasped together. Mickey and Goofy stepped away from us. Mickey, now with his head back on his shoulders, stepped into the shadow. Sleeping Beauty walked forwards with an unwavering smile. We have to take care of our young, don't we? She spoke looking at David, but clearly addressing me. What's your name, little guy? David looked at me and back to Sleeping Beauty. David, he whispered. Sleeping Beauty lowered herself to David's eye level and gave him a nice, toothy smile. A.D. Goodbye, David. She spoke, soft and kind, with one of her hands reaching out to hold David's hand. And good night. Raising back up to meet my stare, she continued her almost inhuman smile. You're going to want to get that off of you. She pointed at my arm. There was what I first thought to be a strand of hair resting on my bare arm. What I thought was a hair then spread out and seemed to multiply until it was a scraggly clump with thin strands reaching around. I felt a small prick as a number of the strands seemed to try and wriggle their way into my pores. Quickly, I raised my other hand and grabbed the mass. As I pried it from my arm, the strands continued to brace into my skin. With enough effort, the tendrils were snapped loose, and I chucked the mass to the ground before it could latch onto my hand. The clump moved across the tiled road until it found Sleeping Beauty, who bent over and let it rest in her gloved hands. She nodded, and with that, I grabbed David's hand once more and pulled him towards the exit. His tears were gone, and all that was left was a satisfied grin. I offered one more look back as we got to the exit. They were all there. Each mascot we had come across that day stood in the dark, watching us leave. Our drive home was long, quick for David, though. He passed out in the passenger seat, clutching one of the souvenirs we had purchased. I tried to get the images out of my head on the ride home, each stray strand of hair in the car sending me into a mild panic, until the wind pouring in from the windows whisked it away. I think what was most disturbing to me, even as horrific as the fur mascots were, being held together by whatever the hell was inside there, was Sleeping Beauty, her calm and collected attitude, and most unnerving, when she flashed that toothy grin to my son. The light above us perfectly bounced off those pearly whites and the black strands that were poking out from the small gaps in her teeth. David has never brought it up, despite me asking if there was anything he wanted to talk about, and he only reminisces about the positive experiences of that day. I'm not sure if we'll ever go back, but if we do, we'll be sure to leave before closing time.